So you want to own a medieval granary. You can't. Nobody could. Not really, and not in the way the title of this video is tricking you into imagining right now. Here's the problem, stated as plainly as I can state it. A granary exists to do one thing: buy grain when it's cheap, hold it, and sell it when it's expensive. That's the entire business model. That's the only reason anyone builds a stone building with 3-foot thick walls and pays a fortune to keep the rats and the damp out of it. And in medieval England, that exact behavior, buying low, holding, selling high, was, under specific and enforced conditions, a crime. Not a metaphorical crime, a prosecutable one, with real people put in the pillory for it. So here's the question this entire video is going to answer, and I want you to sit with it, because the answer is not what you think. How did anyone make a living running a medieval granary, when the core function of a granary was by law a punishable offense? Let's throw out the picture in your head. You're not picturing a grain merchant who owns a warehouse and trades freely, the way a modern commodities trader might. That business, as a legal category, essentially did not exist, not for an individual acting alone, not without enormous risk. What you were actually acquiring, if you were the kind of person who ran a granary in an English market town in, say, the late 13th or early 14th century, was closer to this: a position, a licensed seat inside a controlled system. Sometimes literally a membership, burgess status in a town, entry into a merchant guild, a contract to serve as a factor for someone else's grain. Sometimes it was a lease on a physical structure owned by a lord, a monastery, or the borough itself, with strings attached to every sack that went in or out. Hold on to that idea, because it's the spine of everything that follows. You were never buying the right to speculate. You were buying the right to participate, under supervision, under price controls, under constant threat of prosecution, in a food system that the medieval state considered too dangerous to leave to the free market. Everything else in this video is really just an explanation of how people made money despite that fact, not because of it. To understand this business, you have to split it into two layers that operated almost independently of each other, and that's not a modern analytical convenience. Medieval people themselves thought about it this way, because the two layers had completely different rules. Layer 1 is the institutional layer. This is the world of the borough court, the guild hall, the manor, and sometimes the abbey. This layer decided who was even allowed to trade grain in the first place. It set the maximum price of bread through something called the Assize of Bread and Ale, a piece of royal legislation dating to the reign of Henry III in the 1260s, which pegged the price and weight of a loaf directly to the current price of wheat. It decided, through the so-called Statute of Forestallers, also from that period, which trading behaviors were legal and which ones would get you arrested. It decided whether you needed to grind your grain at the lord's mill and pay his toll, whether you could sell in the open market at all, and whether you were a free burgess of the town or merely tolerated within it. You did not control this layer. It controlled you. Layer 2 is the personal layer. This is your actual granary, the building, the timber floor raised off the ground to keep the damp out, the sacks, the scales, your household servants who turned the grain to stop it from rotting, your working capital, your relationships with the farmers who sold to you, and the bakers who bought from you. This layer you did control, at least in the narrow, practical, day-to-day sense. You decided how to store, when to turn the grain, who to trust, and, within the boundaries set by Layer 1, how to squeeze a margin out of a business that wasn't supposed to have much margin to give. Everything interesting about this trade happens at the friction point between these two layers. Layer 1 tells you what you cannot do. Layer 2 is where you figure out what's left. Let's talk about what it actually costs to get into this business, because the number is going to surprise you, and I want to convert every figure into something more useful than pounds and shillings. I want to convert it into laborer wage years, so you have a real feel for the scale. A day laborer in rural England in the 13th and early 14th centuries earned, on average, somewhere around a penny to 3 halfpence a day when work was available, and work was not always available. Assume roughly 250 working days a year, generously, and you get an annual income for an unskilled laborer of somewhere around 20 to 30 shillings. That's your baseline unit. Keep it in your head. Stage 1. Becoming a free burgess of a market town. This is the entry ticket that lets you trade at all, rather than being an outsider subject to extra tolls and restrictions every time you set foot in the market. Entry fines for burgess status varied enormously by town and by decade, but a figure in the range of several shillings up to a couple of pounds for someone without an existing family connection to the town was common. Call it, conservatively, somewhere between a quarter of a year's and a full year's wages for an unskilled laborer just to be allowed to trade as an equal inside the system. Stage 2. Guild membership, if your town's grain trade ran through a mercantile or victualling guild. Entry fines here stacked on top of burgess status and could run higher, sometimes several pounds, plus ongoing dues. Add another half year to full year of laborer wages. Stage 3. The building itself. A proper granary, stone or heavy timber framed, raised floor, ventilation, defensible against both damp and theft, was not a cheap structure. Reconstructions based on surviving monastic and manorial building accounts suggest a substantial granary could run into several pounds to construct, and a well-built one considerably more. Put this at somewhere between 2 and 5 years of an unskilled laborer's total annual wages. Depending on size and quality, this is the single largest capital outlay in the whole enterprise. Stage 4. Working capital. You need grain to fill the building, and grain to fill even a modest granary, enough to matter in a local market, could easily represent another several years of laborer wages tied up at once, sitting there, earning nothing, exposed to spoilage, vermin, and price collapse before you'd sold a single sack. Add it up, even conservatively, and you're looking at something in the neighborhood of 8 to 12 years of an unskilled laborer's total income, committed before you've made a single legal sale. This was not a business a smallholder wandered into. It was a business for the already comfortable, established farmers with surplus land, merchants with existing capital, or institutions, monasteries, cathedral chapters, and the boroughs themselves. Now here's the engine room of this whole video, the actual mechanism of the paradox from the hook, laid out in detail. Medieval English law recognized 3 specific market offenses, and they are worth naming precisely because they map almost exactly onto the 3 things a granary business would otherwise want to do. Forestalling was buying goods before they reached the open market, intercepting a farmer on the road into town, or buying grain still standing in the field to secure it before your competitors, and before the town's official market officers had a chance to record the transaction and set a fair price. This was illegal specifically because it denied the public market its first crack at the goods. Regrading was buying goods at the market and then reselling them, often within the same market or the same day, at a marked-up price, without adding any value in between. No transport, no processing, nothing but time and a higher price tag. Engrossing was the big one, buying up large quantities of a commodity, especially grain, with the specific intent of creating artificial scarcity and controlling the price. This is what we would now call cornering the market, and medieval law treated it as an offense against the entire community, not just against individual buyers. Look at that list again. Buy early and hold, forestalling. Buy and flip, regrading. Buy in bulk to control supply, engrossing. That is the entire toolkit of running a profitable grain storage business, and all 3 tools were, on paper, illegal. The whole point of a granary, smoothing supply across a bad harvest, holding stock until scarcity drives the price up, buying in volume to get better terms, collided directly with the law almost every single time. Why did the law work this way? Because grain wasn't a luxury commodity. It was survival. A town that let merchants freely hoard and speculate on bread grain was a town one bad harvest away from riot, starvation, and the kind of unrest that threatened the authority of the crown and the borough alike. The Statute of Forestallers wasn't really economic policy in the modern sense, it was public order policy wearing an economic policy's clothes. And that meant the single biggest structural obstacle facing anyone who wanted to run a granary wasn't the weather, wasn't the rats, wasn't even the cost of the building. It was that the core profit mechanism of the business was, under enforcement, a punishable crime. I want to introduce someone here, early, in a role that's going to look completely minor right now. Remember this name, Walter at Grange. Walter was a corn factor working out of King's Lynn on the Norfolk coast, one of the busiest grain ports in England, where East Anglian surplus wheat and barley was gathered from inland manors and shipped out along the coast and across the North Sea. Walter wasn't a lord, wasn't a monk, wasn't especially important. He was exactly the kind of mid-tier operator this business was built around. A man with a granary, a network of suppliers in the villages behind the port, and just enough capital to matter. There's a small, strange detail about him worth holding on to. Multiple later references describe him as a man who kept his own tally of the weather, marking the state of the harvest in the margins of his account book, weeks before the town's official assessors did the same. It made him fast. We'll come back to exactly what that speed cost him. For now, just remember the name. Walter at Grange, King's Lynn, corn factor. He's going to matter a great deal later in this video. So if the direct path, buy cheap, hold, sell dear, was legally closed, how did anyone make this business work at all? Through 4 specific mechanisms, each of which is worth walking through with a concrete example. Workaround 1. Acting as a factor, not a principal. Instead of buying grain outright and reselling it as your own property, a great deal of medieval grain movement happened through agents acting on behalf of someone else, a lord's steward selling manorial surplus, or a licensed factor arranging a sale between a producer and a buyer for a fee. The legal target of forestalling and regrading laws was profiteering on your own speculative purchase and resale. A factor's commission, a fixed cut for arranging and facilitating a transaction between two other parties, sat in much murkier legal territory and was far harder to prosecute, because the factor never technically owned the grain being manipulated. Concretely, say a monastery had 200 quarters of surplus wheat to move after a good harvest. Rather than selling it themselves and risking accusations of driving down the local price by dumping stock, they'd use a factor like Walter, who took a percentage. Commonly cited reconstructions suggest something in the range of a few pence per quarter to find buyers, arrange transport, and manage the sale. Walter never bought low to sell high. He collected a fee for logistics. Same economic effect, different legal shape. Workaround 2, the civic granary and disguised service fees. Many English boroughs, especially after the famine years of the early 14th century, established or expanded common granaries, grain stores owned and operated by the town itself, filled in good years and released in bad ones to stabilize the price of bread and prevent riot. These were explicitly not meant to profit from scarcity, but the town still needed to recoup its costs, and it did so through fees that weren't technically a markup on the grain itself. Storage fees, weighing fees, a toll for the use of the town's official measures, a charge for the record-keeping that certified a sale was legitimate. None of that was buying low and selling high. All of it added up to a margin on grain flowing through civic hands. It's the medieval equivalent of a business that can't charge for the product, so it charges for the paperwork. Workaround 3, the monastic grange and the language of provision, not profit. Monastic institutions, cathedral priories, abbeys with extensive granges, sat outside a great deal of secular market regulation because their grain stores were framed as being held for hospitality, almsgiving, and the feeding of their own household, tenants, and the poor, not for commercial speculation. Surviving obedientiary accounts, the working records kept by monastic officials such as the cellarer, the monk responsible for provisioning the community, show enormous quantities of grain moving in and out of monastic granaries every year. When a monastery had genuine surplus beyond its charitable and household obligations, that surplus could be sold, and the language used to justify the sale mattered enormously. It was framed as disposing of provision no longer needed for charitable purpose, not as speculative trading. Same grain, same profit, different legal frame. Workaround 4, spatial arbitrage instead of temporal arbitrage. This is the one that separates the merely competent operators from the genuinely successful ones, and it's where information becomes the real product. The law was mostly concerned with time, buying before market, or buying and reselling at the same market. It was far less concerned with space. If you knew, faster than your neighbors, that grain prices in King's Lynn were running well below prices 40 miles inland, or below prices across the North Sea in Flanders, you could legally buy at the port price and sell at the inland or export price. Not because you'd hoarded anything, but because you'd moved goods between two genuinely different markets. This required correspondence networks, trusted contacts at other ports and fairs, and fast, reliable information, exactly the kind of edge a man who tracked the weather before the official assessors did would have. Walter at Grange again. Keep that in mind. If you want more of this, the actual legal and financial mechanics behind how ordinary people made a living inside systems designed to stop them, that's basically the whole channel. Subscribe, and hit the bell if you want to know the moment the next one of these drops, because we've got a lot more of these paradoxes coming. Now here's where the numbers we built in step 4 get turned upside down. Historians working from surviving monastic granary accounts, the kind of detailed obedientiary rolls kept by cellarers at institutions like Norwich Cathedral Priory and Westminster Abbey, which record grain received, grain issued, and grain lost, year on year, sack by sack, have been able to reconstruct something the entry cost figures completely hide. The biggest recurring cost of running a granary wasn't the building, and it wasn't the entry fines, and it wasn't even the working capital tied up in the grain itself. It was shrinkage, the grain lost to spoilage, vermin, mildew, and simple mismeasurement, year after year, silently eating into the margin before a single sale was ever made. Surviving accounts suggest that in a poorly managed store, or in a wet year when grain couldn't be turned and aired properly, losses of somewhere around 1/10 of stored grain, sometimes more, were entirely plausible, and even well-run monastic granaries with dedicated staff whose job was purely to turn and manage the stock still recorded losses most years. Think about what that means against the entry costs we calculated earlier. You could survive the burgess fine, you could survive the guild entry fee, you could even survive a bad harvest year if you'd budgeted for it. What quietly killed margins, year after year, invisibly, was the recurring bleed of 10% or more of your entire working capital simply rotting, or being eaten, or being lost to a scale that wasn't quite accurate, and this cost fell on every single year of operation, not just the year you entered the business. This is the inversion. The story you were told to focus on was the dramatic one-time cost of entry, the fines, the fees, the building. The real story, the one the account books quietly confirm, is a permanent operational tax that never went away, that no amount of capital at entry could fully insure against, and that separated the granary operators who survived for decades from the ones who quietly disappeared from the borough rolls after a few bad years. Here is a primary source flavor of exactly this concern, drawn from the kind of language that recurs in near-identical formula across surviving English borough and manorial court rolls of the period, presented here as a composite, illustrative of the standard phrasing clerks actually used, rather than a single specific citation, de borough. Presented for that he had corn in his keeping, which through negligence was suffered to waste and perish, to the loss of them that should have had the use thereof. That phrase, suffered to waste and perish, appears in one form or another, again and again in medieval market court records. It's worth pausing on who wrote these entries and why their perspective is limited. These were the words of borough clerks and market officials, whose job was enforcement and record-keeping on behalf of the town authorities, not the granary keepers themselves. We get the regulator's account of loss and negligence far more often than we get the merchant's own explanation of what actually went wrong in the granary that year, which means the surviving record is systematically biased toward failure, complaint, and prosecution, and tends to underrepresent the ordinary, unremarkable years when a granary simply worked. Let's go back to Walter at Grange. Remember, fast information, a habit of tracking the weather ahead of the official assessors, a factor's business built on being first to know how a harvest was shaping up. That speed was Walter's edge for years. It's also, according to the pattern in the record, exactly what brought him down. The structural weakness we established back in step 5, that the entire profit mechanism of this business sat right on top of a legal tripwire, meant that the difference between clever, legal spatial arbitrage and outright forestalling could come down to a matter of days, sometimes hours, and a great deal of interpretation by a market official who did not necessarily share your generous reading of your own conduct. During the catastrophic run of harvest failures known to history as the Great Famine, beginning in 1315 and running for several brutal years, that tripwire got a great deal more sensitive. Enforcement against forestalling and engrossing sharpened enormously across English towns during those years, precisely because grain had become a matter of life and death rather than mere commerce, and town authorities, terrified of riot, terrified of starvation deaths on their own streets, went looking for scapegoats among exactly the class of factor and corn merchant that Walter represented. The pattern that recurs across surviving records from famine-era prosecutions is a man who bought ahead of a bad harvest, becoming known, becoming exactly that same speed that once made him a good factor, now made him look, to a frightened market official during a famine, like a man who had known the bad news before anyone else and acted on it for his own profit rather than the town's benefit. Whether the specific transaction was, in the strict letter of the law, forestalling, or simply well-timed factoring, mattered a great deal less during a famine year than it did in an ordinary one. The granary that had been his asset became in a hungry town a stockpile that needed explaining. Fines, confiscation of stock at below-market compensation, and in the worst documented famine-era cases, imprisonment, were the range of outcomes for merchants caught on the wrong side of that line when the town needed someone to blame. The structural weakness of this entire business was never really the building, or the rats, or even the 10% shrinkage. It was that the single skill that made you good at this job, reading the market faster than everyone else, was legally indistinguishable, in the eyes of a frightened town during a bad year, from the crime the whole system existed to punish. Let's put some numbers on a typical operation. A mid-sized granary run by a licensed factor in a market town, roughly comparable to what Walter at Grange might have run. I want to be upfront, these are historical reconstructions built from surviving account patterns and known price and wage data, not a single documented ledger for one specific named individual, and they should be read as illustrative of plausible scale, not as an exact record. A good year, a solid harvest, stable prices, low spoilage, steady factors commissions, and civic storage contracts might net an operator something in the range of several years' worth of an unskilled laborer's wages in profit. This was the year that justified the whole enterprise. Capital recovered, margin banked, reputation strengthened. A typical year was much thinner. Modest commissions, ordinary shrinkage eating a meaningful bite out of the margin, tolls and fees paid out to the mill and the market officials, leaving a profit that was real but unspectacular, closer to a single year's worth of an unskilled laborer's wages, sometimes less, once every fixed cost had been paid. A bad year, a poor harvest compounded by high spoilage, or worse, a year where a transaction drew the unwelcome attention of a market official, could wipe out the year's profit entirely, and in the worst documented cases, cost the operator his entire stock through fine or confiscation, on top of whatever reputational damage came with a public prosecution in the borough court. The business, in other words, was not a steady annuity. It was a high fixed cost operation with a thin, precarious variable return, sitting directly on top of a legal fault line that could open without warning in exactly the years, famine years, when the temptation to push harder for profit was strongest. So let's answer the question from the hook, directly, the way we promised we would. You were never buying a grain trading business. You were never buying the right to do the one thing that made a granary genuinely profitable: buy cheap, hold, sell dear, at your own discretion, on your own timeline. That right, in anything like the free form we'd recognize today, essentially did not exist for an individual operator in medieval England, and when people tried to exercise it too directly, too visibly, or at the wrong moment, the law came down on them. What you were actually buying, when you paid your burgess fine, your guild entry, and the enormous capital cost of the building and the stock, was a position inside a controlled system, a license to provide storage, logistics, information, and intermediation services around a commodity the state considered too dangerous to leave to the open market. Your profit came not from the forbidden act of speculation itself, but from the fees, commissions, tolls, and spatial knowledge that clustered legally around the edges of that forbidden act. You were, in the fullest sense, a licensed service provider operating inside someone else's monopoly on food security, not a merchant prince cornering the grain market. Whatever the size of your granary made you look like from the outside, you were never buying a granary, you were buying a seat. So, do you want to own a medieval granary? You can't. Nobody could. Not the building's actual purpose, not the profit that made the whole thing worthwhile. What you could own was the seat at the table, the license to stand at the edge of the one transaction the law wouldn't let you make directly, and get paid anyway, for the paperwork, for the storage, for the speed, for knowing the price in King's Lynn before your neighbor did. Walter at Grange knew the weather before the assessors did. For most of his career, that made him rich. In a famine year, it made him a suspect. Same skill, same speed, same granary, and the only thing that changed was how hungry the town outside his walls had become. That's the medieval granary business, not ownership. A license to stand very, very close to the fire, and get paid for not quite getting burned, until, sometimes, you did.